Hey friends, tonight we're going to set aside our maps and screens and drift back through time, thousands of years, into a world where people found their way without coordinates or compasses. Together we'll explore how humans once navigated using only the stars, stories, songs, and the memory of the land beneath their feet. Before we begin, feel free to like the video and subscribe if this kind of slow, thoughtful journey is something you enjoy. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing where in the world we're quietly connecting from. Now, get comfortable and let's begin tonight's journey into the world before the map, from start to sleep. Imagine a world without maps, no glowing blue lines guiding you home, no paper charts folded and creased with age, no place names pinned to landscapes, just earth and sky, the rise of a mountain in the distance, the curve of a river, the direction of the wind. In this world, orientation is not something found in your pocket, but something carried in the body, in memory, in story. For most of human history, this was the only world we knew. Before borders, before coordinates, before lines were drawn onto paper or pixels, people moved across vast landscapes with no physical guide but their senses, their ancestors' stories, and the patterns of nature. The map was not a separate object. It was sung, spoken, remembered, and felt. It was stitched into myth, into ritual, into daily movement. It lived in the rhythms of walking, in the stars above, in the shapes of trees and the turns of the wind. To modern minds, shaped by satellites and smartphones, this might seem impossible. How could anyone find their way across oceans, or deserts, or mountains, without a fixed chart? But for tens of thousands of years, humans have done exactly that. Long before cartography emerged as a formal practice, navigation was something deeper, embodied, intuitive, and astonishingly accurate. There's a quiet intelligence to a world navigated without maps. It requires attention, patience, memory. It requires listening to what the land is saying, watching where the birds fly, knowing where the stars rise and fall in different seasons. It means paying attention to the way trees lean, how animals move, where water gathers after the rain. This way of moving through the world without abstraction, without distance, shaped not only how people traveled, but how they thought, how they remembered, how they told stories, and how they saw themselves in relation to the land. It made geography a form of memory and movement a form of knowledge. In this story, we will walk through time and across continents, exploring how people navigated the world long before the map was ever drawn. We will meet star watchers and song singers, animal trackers and ocean voyagers. We will visit memory landscapes, ceremonial paths, and invisible highways. We will trace the astonishing ways in which humans have remembered where they are, through song, through story, through silence. This is not just a history of how to get from one place to another. It is a history of how people have known the world. Early human navigation, long before language was written, long before history was recorded. Human beings were already moving. They walked across grasslands, followed rivers, climbed mountains, and crossed deserts. They left behind no roads, no signs, no formal records, yet they remembered where to go, and they returned to the same places again and again. Early humans, even those who lived nearly 2 million years ago, were already migrants. Homo erectus, one of our distant ancestors, moved out of Africa and into Eurasia, following game and water sources, reacting to changing climates, and slowly adapting to new landscapes. They had no tools for drawing what they saw, but they carried knowledge with them, knowledge of paths, of dangers, of places to rest. This knowledge lived in the group. It was passed by word, by gesture, by repetition. In hunter-gatherer societies, movement was not an interruption of life. It was life itself. People did not stay still and draw a world around them. They moved through the world and remembered it by doing so. Memory was the map. It lived in the body, in the muscles that remembered the slope of a hill, the turn of a river, the way the light shifted in a certain grove of trees. Children grew up walking the land with their elders. As they walked, they listened. They heard stories not just for entertainment, but for survival. A tale about a monster in the forest might be a memory of a dangerous place. A song about a hero's journey might trace a real path between water sources. Over time, these oral stories became layered with detail, repetition, and rhythm. They were designed to be remembered, designed to last. There was no need to separate the story from the land. The land was the story. To know it was to walk it. To walk it was to remember it. Even today, remnants of this way of knowing still exist. In parts of the Kalahari Desert, the San people, among the oldest continuous cultures on Earth, have passed down tracking knowledge for generations. They can follow the faintest imprint of an antelope's hoof across dry sand. But their knowledge goes far beyond prints. They notice the angle of the grass, the warmth of the earth, the presence of small insects that might feed on blood. They understand the entire web of signs that nature gives. In the Arctic, the Inuit have long navigated vast, icy landscapes with no obvious landmarks. Snow and ice change constantly. The light is flat. Yet Inuit travelers read the snow like a text. They feel the hardness of the ice beneath their sleds. They observe how snowdrifts form under specific winds. They notice subtle changes in the color of light or the shape of clouds. These are not maps in the way we think of maps, but they are maps in motion, living, breathing, responsive, to move through the world before maps required something different than what we rely on today. It required an alertness to the environment, a memory shaped by experience, and a deep trust in the knowledge of those who came before. There was no detour into abstraction. The land was learned through the feet, the skin, the ears, the story spoken around the fire. And that knowledge, though fragile, was astonishingly resilient. Before there were maps, there were memories, and memory was enough, navigating by the stars. When the land offers no clear path, when the earth is wide and uncertain, people look upward. The night sky, constant in its slow turning, has always been a guide. Long before the stars were studied, named, or charted, they were watched. They were remembered. They were followed. All over the world, early cultures learned to navigate by the stars. They learned which constellations rose in which seasons, which ones pointed north, which ones marked the passage of time. The stars became more than just a map. They became companions, storytellers, symbols of order in a changing world. In Mesopotamia, one of the earliest cradles of civilization, the movements of stars and planets were observed with great care. Babylonian astronomers recorded celestial patterns on clay tablets, noting how the skies corresponded with floods, planting seasons, and journeys. Though their charts were rudimentary by modern standards, their understanding of the sky allowed for sophisticated predictions and safe passage across deserts and rivers. The ancient Egyptians aligned their lives with the heavens. The star Sirius, whose rising heralded the annual flooding of the Nile, was sacred. Farmers watched for its appearance to know when to plant. Travelers knew which stars to follow when moving through the desert. Even their monumental architecture reflected celestial alignments, suggesting that orientation, knowing where one was in relation to the stars, was as much spiritual as practical. But perhaps no culture embodied star navigation more completely than the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. For tens of thousands of years, Aboriginal Australians used the night sky as both calendar and compass. But they did not just look at the stars, they listened to them. Stories passed down through generations linked each star to places on Earth. These stories, known as dreaming tracks or songlines, formed intricate, continent wide systems of navigation. A song might describe the path of an ancestral being, moving through valleys and across rivers, and by singing that song in the correct order, a traveler could trace the same path, step by step. The stars above reflected the land below. A constellation might echo the shape of a mountain range, or mark the location of a waterhole. The sky was not separate from the earth, it was its mirror, its memory, its guide. These oral star maps were not just practical tools, they were sacred. Each journey was not just a movement through space, but a reenactment of mythic history. The traveler was not just finding their way, they were keeping the world alive through song. Across the Pacific Ocean, a different kind of celestial mastery developed. The Polynesians, whose ancestors voyaged across thousands of miles of open sea, used a star-based navigation system so precise that it rivaled early European cartography. Without compasses, without written maps, they sailed between islands by reading the stars, the swells, the wind, and the flight of birds. Their knowledge was taught through chance and visual memory, passed from master navigator to apprentice in a lineage of skill that required decades to master. In the northern world, the Norse sailors looked to the sky as well. They used a tool called a sunstone, a crystalline lens that helped locate the sun even on cloudy days. They followed the North Star Polaris, which remains fixed in the northern sky. Their sagas, too, contain directional knowledge, descriptions of sailing days, prevailing winds, and landmarks known by those who came before. The sky has always offered more than beauty. It has offered direction, rhythm, memory. In a world without maps, it is a map written in light. But to read it requires patience. A single star means little on its own. It is the pattern, the relationship, the story that gives it meaning. To navigate by the stars is to trust something beyond oneself. It is to look up, to remember, and to move forward into the dark carried by memory and light, memory landscapes and songlines. Long before the world was cut into lines and borders, the land itself spoke in song. For Indigenous Australians, the terrain was not an object to be charted, but a living story to be remembered. Across deserts, forests, and plains, people navigated not by symbols on paper, but by songs, complex, layered compositions passed down through generations that described every ridge, every waterhole, every tree of significance. These were the songlines, oral maps etched not in ink, but in voice, rhythm, and ritual. Each song was a path, a route walked by ancestral beings in the dreaming, the time when the world was formed. These beings, through their journeys, created the features of the land, carved out valleys, raised mountains, and named every creature. The songs that tell of their movements are not just sacred, they are practical. They contain embedded instructions for travel, for survival. To walk a songline is to reenact the journey of the ancestor. Each verse might mark a landmark, a bend in the river, a cluster of trees, a sacred rock. The pitch of the song might rise at a hill, or pause at a water source. The melody changes with the terrain. A traveler who knows the song can cross hundreds of kilometers, navigating without sight of trail markers or maps, guided only by memory and sound. The land is, quite literally, a library, and the songs are its catalog. This concept of mapping through memory and rhythm is not unique to Australia. In Central Africa, the Luba people of the Congo developed a system of mnemonic devices known as lukasa, elaborately carved wooden memory boards that function as tactile maps of genealogy, history, and geography. Covered with shells, beads, and carvings, the lukasa are read with the fingers and recited aloud. A skilled user can recount entire dynasties, regional relationships, migration patterns, and sacred places by moving across the board in specific patterns. Though small enough to be held in the hand, a lukasa can contain the knowledge of vast territories. Such systems of memory landscapes, where geography is encoded into oral, physical, and musical structures, demonstrate an alternative to cartography as we know it. These methods are not static representations of place, they are dynamic, performative, alive. To remember a place is to speak it, to sing it, to enact it. Among some indigenous groups, knowledge of place was not something one could simply read, it had to be earned. Young people were taken on ritual journeys, often lasting weeks or months, during which they were taught the songs and stories that linked each location. These journeys were not just about knowing where things were, they were about learning the relationships between things, between humans and animals, between seasons and resources, between the living and the ancestral. In this worldview, landscape is not separate from the self. One does not use the land, one participates in it. Navigation, then, is not about reaching a destination, it's about maintaining a relationship with a living, storied world. Even today, in parts of Australia where songlines are still taught and sung, this oral geography persists. Despite the scars of colonization and the loss of language, the songs remain resilient. They're acts of memory, resistance, and continuity. They remind us that long before satellites and surveys, humans were mapping the world not by flattening it onto paper, but by singing it into being. In these systems, the map is not something separate from life. It is life, and it moves with every step, every breath, every verse, animal trails, and natural markers. Before the compass needle turned toward the North Star, before wind roses adorned the edges of charts, there were other guides, older, quieter, etched into the earth by the movement of animals and the patient gaze of those who followed them. For many hunter-gatherer cultures, the land was not a blank canvas waiting to be mapped. It was already written upon, inscribed with paths, scents, tracks, and shadows, and to read it required not ink, but attention. Among the Sand people of southern Africa, sometimes called the Bushmen, tracking is both survival and sacred skill. A master tracker can interpret the faintest indentations in the sand, a broken blade of grass, the direction of a bent twig, the subtle shape of a hoof print softened by wind. Each sign tells a story. This spoor, still sharp, speaks of a kudu that passed at dawn. That twisted root, scuffed slightly, might mean a lion crouched here before the sun touched the plain. But tracking is not merely about finding prey. It is a way of navigating, of orienting oneself in space and time. Trackers know which animals pass where and when. They know which trails lead to waterholes, which to danger, which vanish when the rains come. Some trails are seasonal, some ancient. Over generations, families and clans memorized the movements of animals like a living web of paths that can span hundreds of kilometers. These paths were never fixed. The map changed with the wind, with the herd, with the seasons, but the mind adjusted with it. In the Arctic, Inuit hunters follow a different kind of trail, not of sand and hooves, but of ice and silence. On the frozen seascape, there are no trees or mountains to guide the way, but the Inuit read the wind-sculpted snow, the grain of ice, the way light bounces off a ridge. They follow the paths of caribou and polar bears, and know the safe passages across sea ice that shifts daily. Some even listen for subtle echoes, how the sound of a sled returns can reveal the thickness of the ice beneath. And in North America, many indigenous groups developed deep traditions of tracking and natural wayfinding. The Plains tribes, like the Lakota and Cheyenne, once followed the migrations of buffalo across vast, open landscapes. But they did not wander aimlessly. They moved with knowledge of the animals, of the rivers, of the sky. Trails formed naturally along ridges, valleys, and old game paths, often marked with bent trees, cairns, or carved stones. Among the Anishinaabe and other woodland tribes, scouts and elders use tree markers known as trail trees, young saplings deliberately bent and tied to grow in specific directions. These living signposts pointed toward important locations: water, gathering sites, trade routes. Over decades, they became part of the forest itself, an organic compass rooted in time. To navigate such worlds is to know how to see, not just to look, but to notice, to sense the wind's shift, the scent of a distant fire, the way birds lift from trees with warning. It is to know the language of the land in its quietest expressions. Smells become signs. The pungent scent of a wet animal's fur tells you how far it passed. The taste of the air changes near a spring. The glint of light through tall grass might mark a game trail worn by generations. These are not myths. They are practices preserved through oral teaching, observation, and lifelong apprenticeship. They require constant presence. Unlike a map, which you can fold and forget, these methods demand attention. You must be in relationship with the land. To know where you are, you must move slowly, listen deeply. Tracking in this sense is an embodied form of geography. The body becomes the map, the knees remembering the incline, the nose alert to shifts in scent, the skin aware of moisture and heat. Where the modern traveler checks GPS, the traditional tracker checks the wind, the ground, the stars, the behavior of birds. These ancient systems may seem fragile in the face of modernization, but in recent years they've gained renewed recognition. Scientific studies have confirmed the near photographic memory of sand trackers, their ability to recall hundreds of individual spore signatures, animal gaits, and environmental cues. Inuit knowledge is being used to help interpret satellite data and understand changes in polar ice. The world still holds these quiet maps. In every forest, in every desert, there are paths not charted but remembered, and there are those who still know how to walk them, slowly, patiently, listening to the land as it speaks. The Polynesian voyagers. Across the vastness of the Pacific Ocean lies one of the greatest achievements of human navigation, a legacy not of written maps or magnetic compasses, but of memory, motion, and intimacy with the sea. Long before Western explorers dared to lose sight of land, the peoples of Polynesia had mastered an ocean that spans a third of the planet. They sailed from island to island, from Hawaii to Aotearoa to Rapa Nui, in double-hulled canoes, guided by knowledge passed not through paper, but through generations of practice and song. Their system was called wayfinding, a deeply observational, embodied science of navigation. Wayfinders did not rely on abstract measurements. They read the world directly, the stars above, the swells beneath, the flight of birds, the drift of clouds, and the very color of the sea. Central to their navigation was the star compass, a mental model of the night sky. Wayfinders memorized the rising and setting points of dozens of stars on the horizon, each corresponding to a direction. These stellar bearings were not just coordinates, they were companions. As the sky rotated, navigators tracked the stars' arcs to maintain their heading in open water, even with no land in sight. But the heavens were only one layer of this deep navigational system. Just as crucial were the ocean swells, long rolling waves that radiate across the Pacific from distant storms. Experienced navigators could detect the subtle patterns of these swells by the movement of the canoe underfoot. Even when clouds masked the sky, the rhythm of the waves spoke. They could feel when multiple swell directions intersected, when an island's presence disturbed the regularity of the sea's motion. These waves became a kind of map beneath the boat, fluid, changing, but legible to the trained body. They watched cloud formations too. Specific cloud types form over islands, shaped by rising air and moisture. From miles away, the presence of a cumulus cloud in a certain shape might reveal land beyond the horizon. And the flight paths of birds, especially seabirds like the frigate bird and tern, offered another clue. Some birds venture far into open water by day, but always return to land to roost, and the direction of their flight, particularly at dawn or dusk, could be followed like a compass hand. Even the color and texture of water carried meaning. Shifts in hue indicated coral reefs, shallow lagoons, or deep channels. Floating vegetation or debris hinted at proximity to land. Fish species signaled ecological zones. The ocean, far from being a blank expanse, was a richly marked world, alive with signs for those who knew how to interpret them. None of this knowledge was written. It was oral, entrusted to the memory of navigators through chance, training, and long apprenticeship. It was learned by doing, by sailing under the stars, by watching the sea each day of one's life. The PWO navigators, the master navigators of Micronesia and Polynesia, underwent years of instruction before they could be initiated. The canoe was their classroom, the sea their textbook. One of the most celebrated revivals of this tradition came in the 20th century through Mau Piailug, a navigator from the Micronesian island of Satawal. As Western technologies threatened to eclipse traditional knowledge, Mao helped Hawaiians reconnect with ancestral skills. In 1976, he guided the canoe Hokulea across 2,500 miles from Hawaii to Tahiti using only traditional techniques. His success not only astonished modern navigators, but also reignited pride and cultural continuity across the Pacific. Thanks to his legacy, wayfinding is alive once more. The Hokulea has since circled the globe, and schools across Polynesia now teach the arts of star navigation, wave reading, and oceanic memory. These skills are not relics, they are living links to ancestors who mapped the largest ocean on Earth without drawing a single line. Polynesian navigation reminds us that the ocean is not an empty place. It is full of presence, moving patterns, whispers of direction, subtle cues. It requires a different kind of literacy, not one of paper and pen, but of wind and water, of stars and silence. The wayfinder listens not just with ears or eyes, but with the whole body, attuned to the breath of the sea. There are no fixed roads on the ocean, and yet the Polynesians found paths across thousands of miles. Their memory was the map, their skill the compass. In their canoes, they carried not only people and goods, but knowledge, woven into chance, inherited in silence, and passed on by trust. The Andes and the Inca world, high above the coastal plains, where the air thins and the mountains scrape the sky, the Inca Empire once wove its own extraordinary network, not of roads alone, but of memory, labor, and rhythm. The Andes are a landscape of extremes, jagged peaks, deep ravines, shifting weather, and yet the Inca, with neither wheels nor written script, built one of the most intricate logistical systems the world has ever known. At the heart of Incan communication and organization was a mysterious and elegant tool, the quipu. Made of strings and knots, quipus, or quipus, served as tactile records of information. Colored cords hung from a central strand, with knots tied in different positions to signify numbers and categories. Though often interpreted as an accounting system, tracking taxes, census data, and harvests, recent research suggests that quipus may have also encoded narrative or geographical information. Could a quipu be a kind of map? It is possible. If numbers referred to distances, if the colors or placements indicated locations or routes, then the quipu may have served as a mnemonic device for wayfinding across the empire. It is a question that still invites debate, but one that reveals how fluid the idea of a map truly is. Supporting the empire's vast reach was the Capac Nan, the Inca road system, nearly 25,000 miles of trails carved through deserts, forests, and mountaintops. Unlike Roman roads, these were not merely engineering marvels, they were threads of memory and movement. Travelers relied not on signs, but on the oral knowledge passed through generations. The names of peaks, the locations of resting places, the sequence of landmarks. Along these roads ran the shaskis, relay runners trained to carry messages, goods, and knowledge across hundreds of miles. Each shaski memorized the terrain between stations, the names of lords, and the sequence of stopping points. They ran without maps, guided by memory and repetition, their minds as disciplined as their legs. The land itself served as orientation. In a region where visibility can change in moments, the Incas used fixed landmarks, sacred stones, rivers, terraces, and ceremonial sites. Certain mountains, called apus, were not only geographic features, but sacred beings. Travelers paid tribute to them, recognizing their role in the spiritual and navigational order of the world. In a society without written language as we know it, the Inca preserved geographic knowledge through oral tradition, ceremony, and architecture. Stories were tied to places, myths explained the origins of valleys, springs, and trails. In many cases, the very layout of towns and temples reflected cosmological principles tied to direction and distance. The Inca did not draw maps, they built them into the land. Their empire, stretching from modern-day Colombia to Chile, was not stitched together by ink, but by movement, of people, of goods, of memory. And the road was more than a path. It was a song, a responsibility, a living chord. Today, traces of the Kapaknan remain, stone paths winding through cloud forests and high passes. And though the Kipu's full secrets are still untangled, it continues to speak of a time when strings and steps were enough to hold an empire together. Indigenous peoples of the Americas. Long before roads were paved, before compasses pointed north and maps marked borders, the great continent of the Americas breathed with trails carved by memory, shaped by footstep, and whispered through the story. From the high, arid plateaus of the southwest to the dense woodlands of the northeast, from the great plains that echoed with the thunder of buffalo to the winding rivers of the Amazon basin. The land itself taught its people how to move, how to remember, and how to return home. In what we now call North America, indigenous nations cultivated deep knowledge of the land without need for cartography in the Western sense. The Cherokee, the Lakota, the Iroquois, the Apache, and countless others passed down topographical memory through stories, rituals, and songs. Trails were known not as mere paths, but as veins of connection, routes followed by ancestors, marked not by ink, but by tree, rock, and rhythm. One of the more subtle yet striking practices involved the use of trail marker trees. These were young saplings bent deliberately and tied down, trained over years to grow in unusual horizontal shapes. A tree bent at a sharp angle might indicate the direction of a water source, a sacred site, or a distant encampment. Even after generations, these bent trees stood as living signposts, recognizable to those who had been taught their meanings. In the forests of the Northeast and Midwest, cairns, piles of stones, would be carefully arranged as waypoints. Sometimes these stone stacks were simple markers along a trail. Other times, they served ceremonial purposes, remembering a lost soul or a turning point in a migration. The trails themselves were etched not just into soil, but into memory. A person could walk for days, guided not by map or sign, but by the slope of a hill, the curve of a riverbank, the texture of bark, or the flight of a bird. The Iroquois Confederacy, one of the most sophisticated political unions of pre-contact North America, maintained a vast network of trails through what is now New York, Pennsylvania, and beyond. These paths, later adopted and expanded by colonial settlers, were known as the Great Warriors' Paths, some of which evolved into present-day highways. To the Iroquois, these were more than routes of trade or war. They were symbolic arteries of alliance, trust, and spiritual connection. Farther west, the Plains tribes navigated immense grasslands with the help of buffalo trails. Bison, in their ancient wisdom, carved out the most efficient paths across vast distances, paths to water, to salt licks, to seasonal grazing grounds. Indigenous peoples learned to read these trails and follow them, learning from the animals that shared their world. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Kiowa, movement across the plains was not random, but deliberate, governed by ancestral memory and deep environmental intuition. The sky, too, played its role. Stories passed down in oral traditions often included references to the celestial bodies, the position of the sun, the rising of a particular star helping travelers mark time and space. Yet it was not simply astronomy in the Western sense, it was woven into mythology and cultural practice. The land and sky were one continuous story. Further south, in what is now Mexico and Central America, the Maya and Aztec civilizations offer compelling examples of non-cartographic navigation. The Maya, whose civilization flourished in the jungles of the Yucatan and Guatemala, were accomplished astronomers. They aligned their cities and ceremonial centers with celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, and planetary conjunctions, using the stars not only for religious observance but for practical orientation. Though the Maya developed a sophisticated writing system and glyphic codices, much of their navigational knowledge was transmitted orally. Trade routes snaked through the dense jungles and across mountains, remembered through stories, rituals, and songs. The traders known as Polom carried not just goods but knowledge, and their journeys were guided by memories, encoded in language, myth, and repeated practice. The Aztecs, centered around the grand city of Tenochtitlan, built a network of causeways, canals, and roads that connected their empire. Though they used pictographic maps for political or ritual purposes, navigation day to day remained rooted in oral transmission. Roads were known by the stories of those who traveled them, by the gods who walked them first, and by the events that took place along them. Orientation was often solar, directions tied to the rising and setting of the sun, infused with divine meaning. The Andean concept of Seke lines also echoes here, imaginary lines radiating out from a sacred center, often a temple or mountain. Though this was more prominent among the Inca, similar conceptual geography informed how Mesoamerican people understood movement, space, and sacred direction. In many indigenous cultures across the Americas, movement was ceremonial. A journey wasn't merely a change of place, it was a reenactment of myth, a physical echo of a spiritual truth. Pathways remembered the migration of ancestors, the dance of spirits, the passage of seasons. To walk a trail was to participate in the renewal of the world, and all of this remarkably endured without reliance on drawn maps. Navigation was not divorced from experience, it was intimate, embodied, lived. A grandmother might teach her grandson how to recognize the way home by describing the sound of wind through a certain canyon, or the color of lichen on a northern facing rock. A trader might recall his route by reciting a chant passed down through generations, each line of the song marking a bend in the road, a bridge across a river, a place to rest. It is also important to understand that these systems of orientation were not static. They adapted as the environment changed, as rivers shifted course or trails grew over. The knowledge was dynamic, not fossilized. Stories evolved, songs adjusted, and memory recalibrated itself to the living land. This flexibility ensured the survival of these oral geographies over centuries. European colonization disrupted much of this delicate knowledge. Trails were cleared, forests cut, languages lost, sacred markers destroyed. But even today, traces remain, sometimes hidden in place names, in ceremonies, in the inherited instincts of those who still walk the land with ancestral echoes in their ears. In modern times, there's a quiet resurgence, a movement to reclaim these old ways of knowing. Indigenous communities across the Americas are revitalizing their languages, their stories, and their landscapes of memory. Trails once thought forgotten are being remembered, not just by scholars, but by descendants of those who once walked them. There's power in that act of recovering direction, not just through GPS, but through the heart. In a world that now rushes forward with digital maps and satellite precision, there is something profoundly grounding in imagining a trail not as a route on a screen, but as a living story whispered by stone, wind, and sky. The indigenous peoples of the Americas teach us that orientation is not merely a matter of location, but of relationship to place, to history, to spirit. To walk without a map, in their tradition, is not to be lost. It is to be deeply, profoundly found. Africa and the Middle East. Before lines were drawn across sand and stone, before borders fractured deserts, and maps named mountains in foreign tongues. The vast lands of Africa and the Middle East were crossed by memory and guided by stars. These were ancient worlds where orientation was not an external reference but an inner compass, attuned to the wind, to the smell of rain on dust, to the gleam of a constellation rising over distant dunes. The desert has always been a place of paradox, vast and open, yet full of danger, silent and still, yet constantly shifting. For the nomadic peoples of the Sahara and the Arabian Peninsula, navigation was not a simple skill but an inheritance, passed from parent to child like a sacred trust. In the world's harshest environments, getting lost meant death, and so remembering became survival. The Tuareg, often called the blue people for the indigo dye that stains their robes and veils, have roamed the central Sahara for centuries, herding camels, trading salt, and preserving a way of life rooted in oral knowledge. Though they have no tradition of map-making in the European sense, their mental maps are precise, vivid, and astonishing in their depth. A Tuareg caravan leader could recall not only the direction of a distant well, but how many paces separated it from a lone acacia tree, the taste of the water there, the shape of a rock that stood nearby like a guardian spirit. Directions were often given in terms of sun and wind. Go east with the morning wind until the red dunes rise like waves, and you see the flat rock that glows at sunset. These were not vague metaphors, they were instructions as clear and accurate as any GPS. Stars guided night travel when the desert was cooler and safer to cross. The Tuareg, like other Saharan peoples, memorized the positions of specific stars and constellations that rose and set in seasonal rhythms. The Southern Cross, the Pleiades, and the Arc of Orion's belt were not just beautiful, they were compass points in a celestial map. The sky became a trusted guide, its story told over and over in the form of poetry, recitation, and song. Similar traditions flourished in the Arabian Peninsula, where Bedouin tribes moved across great stretches of sand and rock, following routes known to their ancestors for generations. The Bedouins were and are masters of oral navigation. A seasoned guide might hold in his mind 1,000 kilometers of terrain, marked not by distance, but by experience. A camel's gait, the angle of a dune, the sound of footsteps on gravel, each became a line on an invisible chart. Desert navigation also relied heavily on environmental cues that outsiders might overlook. The color of sand, which varies subtly from one region to another, could indicate direction. The way winds sculpted a dune's ridge could tell the time of day. A cluster of withered shrubs might signal a hidden water source nearby. Smell, touch, and the shimmer of heat on the horizon all played a part in building this embodied cartography. The Bedouin term ilm al-firasa, meaning the science of insight, described not only the ability to read human character, but also the skill of reading nature itself, tracks, wind, terrain. It was a holistic knowledge, blending observation with intuition, memorization with inherited wisdom, and it was transmitted entirely through speech, from elder to youth, from story to memory, from lived experience to inner map. Water in these lands was everything. Its locations, wells, oases, seasonal streams, were among the most closely guarded and carefully remembered details of all. The routes between these water points formed the spine of desert navigation. Some wells were known by the taste of their water, others by the legends attached to them. Who had found them? Who had died near them? What dreams had come under their stars? But the art of oral navigation was not limited to deserts. In West Africa, among the Luba people of present-day Democratic Republic of Congo, memory and movement took on richly symbolic forms. The Luba used lukasa, beautifully carved wooden memory boards, in the teaching of history, geography, and genealogy. Each board, embedded with beads, shells, and carved patterns, served as a tactile map of stories and knowledge. While not used for navigation in a literal geographic sense, the Lukasa reflected a broader African tradition of encoding space and direction into memory tools. The idea was not to depict territory abstractly, but to carry it within the body and mind, activated by touch, song, and speech. In this way, geography was never external. It lived within you. In Ethiopia, the highlands were traversed by ancient footpaths, remembered through chant and ritual. Churches and monasteries, perched atop mountains, were oriented to the stars and to the rhythm of religious calendars. Pilgrimage routes across these lands were walked by countless generations, each journey reinforcing the memory of place and purpose. The Nile River, lifeblood of ancient Egypt, also served as a natural guide, its flow dictating the rhythm of life. Though ancient Egyptians did create some of the earliest maps on papyrus and walls, much of their day-to-day navigation relied on knowledge passed orally among fishermen, traders, and priests. They knew the behavior of the river, the moods of its flood, the shifting of its sandbanks. The stars above mirrored the river's winding path, and in that reflection, they found orientation. In both Africa and the Middle East, geography was understood not merely in spatial terms, but in moral and cosmological dimensions. A route might not only lead you across terrain, it might also connect you to ancestors, to sacred obligations, to the invisible architecture of the spirit world. Traveling a path meant stepping into a story already in motion. Colonial impositions would later attempt to replace these ancient systems with rigid maps and renamed landmarks. But the older ways never fully disappeared. Even now, in remote parts of the Sahel, the Sahara, and the Arabian deserts, knowledge is passed quietly, carefully, from old lips to young ears, around fires under the same stars that guided their ancestors. There is something deeply human in this, in the remembering of land without drawing it, in the navigation of the world not through ink, but through intimacy. The Tuareg and Bedouin remind us that to truly know a place, one must listen to it, its wind, its silence, its shimmer, to know direction not as an arrow on a page, but as a whisper of experience. And so, in the age before the map, and even in its shadow, Africa and the Middle East were never without navigation. They had instead a different compass, the inherited memory of paths walked countless times, the trust in stars that do not lie, and the sacred duty of remembering where water waits in the sand. Europe before cartography, before the scrolls of Ptolemy, before the compasses of mariners and the etched lines of surveyors. Europe, too, was a land walked by memory, sung by druids, and dreamed in stars. Its forests were deep and its mountains restless. Travel was not measured in miles, but in days, in seasons, in the stories one carried from village to valley. In ancient times, before the Roman roads stitched the continent into order, the people of Europe moved through oral landscapes, guided by the contours of hills, the scent of pines, the calls of birds at dawn. The land itself was the first language, a dialect of stone, moss, and wind. Among the Celts, who spread across vast stretches of Western and Central Europe, knowledge was preserved not on parchment, but in memory. The Druids, their spiritual leaders and scholars, were trained for decades in the arts of poetry, law, astronomy, and geography. Yet they wrote nothing down. Their knowledge lived entirely within them. When the Roman writer Julius Caesar encountered the Druids in Gaul, he noted with awe that their students would spend up to 20 years committing oral knowledge to memory. Through chants, verses, and ceremonial recitation, they preserved not just cosmology and ritual, but the geography of tribal lands, sacred groves, fording points on rivers, and hidden glens known only to the initiated. These were not maps, they were living geographies held in breath and song. To travel in the Celtic world was to move through myth as much as through landscape. A hill might be the burial place of a warrior king. A river might be the body of a goddess. Direction was infused with the story, and story was anchored in place. You knew where you were not because of coordinates, but because of who had once stood there, what had happened, and what it meant. Far to the north, the Norse and Viking seafarers emerged from the fjords of Scandinavia with their own methods of navigating the known and unknown world, long before the age of charts. Their ships, carved with dragon heads and built for the open sea, crossed vast distances guided by experience, natural signs, and poetic memory. The Vikings were not merely warriors, they were farmers, traders, and navigators of astonishing skill, sailing across the North Sea to England, across the Baltic to the Slavic lands, and even across the Atlantic to Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland, what we now call Newfoundland. They did so without maps, relying on an inherited system of orientation, both practical and poetic. They studied the sun carefully, even on cloudy days. It is believed they used a sunstone, a type of Icelandic spar crystal that polarizes light, to locate the sun's position when it was obscured by clouds or fog. Holding the stone up to the sky, they could find the sun's direction by the way light split and shimmered within the crystal. Though no confirmed artifacts have survived, Icelandic sagas and later texts reference this practice with quiet confidence. Birds also served as guides. Vikings at sea would release ravens from their ships. If the bird circled and returned, land was far. If it flew straight and vanished into the distance, it had found shore. By watching the bird's path, the sailors learned where the world rose again from the sea. They listened to the sea swell, noting changes in wave patterns, how they curled and rolled depending on the wind and nearby landforms. They watched floating driftwood, cloud formations, the color of the water, and even the flight of whales and seabirds. Navigation was not a single technique, but a symphony of attentiveness. Memory played a central role. Vikings composed cedar songs, rhythmic poems that described routes and landmarks. These were often passed down from navigator to apprentice, committed to memory with ritual care. One might recite a verse describing the sequence of islands leading to Iceland, the feel of the ocean at a certain crossing, or the smell of kelp that heralded landfall. In medieval Iceland, where sagas were eventually written down, we find traces of this oral geography, an ocean mapped in story, shaped by the experiences of those who dared to cross it. And while some of these tales blur history and legend, embedded within them are real navigational cues, fragments of a world where to know was to remember. Elsewhere in Europe, in the ancient cities of Greece, we begin to see a blending of oral and visual traditions. Long before the philosopher Anaximander drew his speculative maps of the known world, Greek thinkers relied on spatial memory tools that would later influence navigation in unexpected ways. One such tool was the memory palace, a mental technique credited to the poet Simonides of CEOs. According to legend, Simonides survived the collapse of a banquet hall by remembering where each guest had been sitting. From this, he developed a method of memorization by associating information with imagined architectural spaces. One might visualize a grand house, each room containing an idea, a name, or a sequence. This method became the cornerstone of the classical art of memory, used by orators, philosophers, and eventually monks to memorize vast amounts of information. Though not designed for geographic navigation, the principle was the same: knowledge as spatial experience. You moved through it in your mind. You walked the halls of memory as surely as you walked a forest path. As Christianity spread across Europe, pilgrimages became common. Pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles across uncertain terrain toward shrines and relics. Before printed guides and drawn maps, these journeys were guided by oral instructions: where to turn after the sixth hill, where a certain monastery gave shelter, where a spring cured sickness. These directions were remembered, passed along, corrected, and sung in devotion. Monasteries themselves became hubs of oral geography. Monks who had never left their abbeys could describe the roads to Rome, Jerusalem, or Santiago de Compostela through the recitation of stories told by travelers and the careful memorization of route sequences. Each new arrival added to a collective memory, a kind of human map made of footsteps and faith. Even as the Roman Empire had earlier introduced more formal surveying and road building, much of rural Europe remained unmapped for centuries. Farmers and herders knew their land through inherited names: the old sheep hill, the hollow by the oaks, the stone that sings in winter. These were not abstract locations, they were places steeped in time, in family, in lore. Wolves howled in the forests, bells rang from distant churches, and smoke rose from hearths unseen. Orientation came from layers of sound and scent, from the curve of paths that had been walked since before memory began. It was not about efficiency, it was about knowing where you stood, within the land, within the season, within the story of your people. Eventually the printed map would arrive with its neat lines and Latin labels, its ordered compass rose and ruled scale. But even then the old ways did not vanish. In corners of Europe where roads remained rough and literacy rare, people still found their way by recalling where the sun rose on feast days, where the moss grew thickest, where the ancestor was buried. Europe, too, once knew how to walk without maps. It remembered the world in chants, in songs, in star watching and wind reading, in the rhythms of hooves and the quiet certainty of stone underfoot. And for all the precision that later maps would offer, something subtle was lost: the closeness of place, the intimacy of direction, the art of remembering the way. The arrival of the map, but not the end. The world had long been traveled, remembered, sung, and passed down through the rhythm of footsteps and the constancy of stars before it was ever flattened onto parchment. For tens of thousands of years, people crossed continents guided by memory and story, never once needing to hold the world in their hands to understand where they stood. And yet, eventually, the idea of the map arrived, quietly at first, in clay and ink, as a way of looking not from within the landscape, but above it. The earliest surviving map we know of comes from Babylon, etched in cuneiform, on a clay tablet around 600 BCE. It is not precise in the modern sense. It shows the world as a circle surrounded by water, with Babylon at its center. Cities are marked in wedge shapes. Beyond them lie mythic regions, the place where the sun rises, the mountains of darkness. It is both a cosmology and a geography, a vision of space, rooted in belief as much as observation. This Babylonian tablet was not intended for travelers. It was a way of understanding the world through symbol and scale, a worldview pressed into stone. And yet, with it, the idea had been born. That space could be captured, drawn, stored, and shared beyond memory. In ancient China, map-making emerged early and independently. By the 4th century BCE, Chinese scholars were already creating detailed maps on silk and wood. These maps were practical, used for administration, military campaigns, and irrigation systems. The Chinese approach to geography was deeply empirical, rooted in land surveys, astronomy, and early compasses. The great Chinese geographer Pei Xiu, writing in the 3rd century CE, outlined principles of cartography that emphasized scale, elevation, and accurate depiction of roads and rivers. But even here the old ways persisted alongside the new. Oral geography remained essential in rural regions. Farmers remembered their fields by scent and slope. Merchants still recited verses of trade routes. The map never replaced memory, it merely coexisted with it, another tool in the human longing to know where one is. In Greece, thinkers like Anaximander and Hecataeus began drawing maps in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, based on observation and speculation. Ptolemy, writing in Roman Egypt in the 2nd century CE, brought this to its most elaborate early form. His Geographia was a grand synthesis of knowledge, coordinates, grids, projection systems, far ahead of its time. But it was largely ignored for centuries, rediscovered only in the Renaissance. The Roman Empire, for all its administrative might, did not rely heavily on maps as we imagine them. Instead, they used itineraria, lists of towns, distances, and waypoints, akin to written directions more than spatial representations. A traveler going from Gaul to Rome would not unroll a scroll with hills and rivers, but consult a sequence. This road leads to that town, which lies 3 days from the next. The journey was still experienced in time, not space. One rare exception is the Tabula Peutingeriana, a Roman-era map preserved through medieval copies. It stretches the known world into a ribbon-like band, more like a timeline than a globe. Rivers snake like veins, cities cluster like stars, and roads pulse across the empire. But again, it is not a map to scale. It is a visualization of empire and connectivity, not terrain. As the centuries turned and empires rose and fell, maps began to take on a new power, not just as tools, but as symbols. In the Islamic Golden Age, scholars like al-Idrisi drew detailed charts of the world based on trade, travel, and astronomical observation. Commissioned by the Norman king of Sicily in the 12th century, al-Idrisi's Tabula Rogeriana was a marvel. South at the top, cities and rivers in remarkable detail, and notes taken from sailors and traders across continents. It blended oral testimony with visual abstraction. In medieval Europe, however, maps remained rare and symbolic. Monks illuminated Mappie Mundi, world maps that place Jerusalem at the center, surrounded by biblical geography, creatures of legend, and moral allegory. These were not meant to guide travelers, but to guide the soul. But as the Renaissance dawned, and as exploration and exploitation expanded beyond Europe's shores, maps became more aggressive. They no longer merely showed the world, they claimed it. The age of discovery was also the age of projection. The Mercator projection, developed in 1569, became a powerful tool for the navigation. Straight lines on a globe made flat, but also distorted the relative sizes of continents, inflating power, shrinking the margins. Maps became instruments of empire. They marked territories, drew borders, named rivers in foreign languages. Where once the land had been read by stars and footsteps, it was now charted by surveyors and drawn in ink. What was mapped could be owned, what was unnamed could be renamed, and yet the old ways never truly vanished. Long after maps were printed in books and pasted onto the schoolroom walls, farmers still knew the slope of their land better than any diagram could. Fishermen still read the waves. Shepherds still followed patterns older than nations. In many indigenous communities, especially in Australia, the Americas, and Africa, the oral geographies persisted. In some cases, they were hidden, guarded from colonial erasure. In others, they survived quietly, folded into ritual, song, and story. Even today, in the 21st century, there are places on Earth where maps are little more than background noise, where a person still finds their way by asking a neighbor, watching the trees, feeling the wind on their face, where a boy learns to walk the mountain trails not by looking at a diagram, but by following his grandmother, listening to the words she murmurs about the rock that leans like a sleeping giant, the bend in the stream where the birds change their song. Technology surrounds us now. Satellites gaze down from orbit, our phones whisper directions, cars trace glowing lines on glass screens. We live in a mapped world wrapped in coordinates. Yet we're also beginning to remember what was almost forgotten. There is a growing return among scholars, adventurers, and storytellers to traditional navigation. In the Pacific, Polynesian wayfinding has seen a revival, led by master navigators like Nainoa Thompson and the legacy of Maupielog. In the Arctic, young Inuit are being taught how to read sea ice and stars, how to find their way across a landscape that changes every season but is still familiar to those who listen. In Africa, elders share desert knowledge with new generations. In the Americas, tribal trails are being retraced, resung, rewalked. The map, for all its utility, does not contain the world. It never did. It cannot tell you how the wind moves through a canyon at dawn. It cannot carry the story of the ancestor who first crossed a ridge. It cannot teach you the taste of water drawn from a hidden spring, or the silence between songs under a starlit sky. These things still belong to memory, to presence, to walking, to wonder. And so the story does not end with the arrival of the map. It deepens. Because even today, in cities and forests and deserts alike, the world is still navigated not just by lines and numbers, but by story, by the feel of place, by the inheritance of knowledge carried not in books, but in bodies and breath. To know where you are is not merely to pinpoint a location. It is to stand in relation to land, to history, to memory, and to those who walked before. We are still, all of us, walking the old paths. Conclusion. Long before the world was drawn in ink or rendered in satellites, it was sung, walked, remembered, and passed from voice to voice. From the deserts of Africa to the ice of the Arctic, from the stars above Polynesia to the trails beneath Incan feet, People moved through space not with paper maps, but with stories, rhythms, and deep remembering. This was a world navigated through intimacy, intimacy with land, with sky, with the bodies of animals, and the movements of ancestors. Memory and movement were entwined. Geography was not separate from life, it was life. And even now, beneath the layers of digital maps and GPS signals, that older world quietly endures, in oral traditions, in sacred journeys, in the wisdom of those who still listen to the land. To navigate is not simply to arrive, it is to remember, to belong, and to move with purpose through time. Thank you for walking with me through this story of a world without maps. May your path be gentle, your stars bright, and your memory wide as the land beneath your feet. Good night.